Good evening. As the director of Goethe-Institut, Max Müller-Baumann in Mumbai, I'm having the great pleasure of welcoming everyone present here, as well as our virtual audiences, to our first public event of 2022, which also happens to be our first truly hybrid one. State of Nature, which, as the name suggests, is based on ecology and climate change, and it was initiated in 2018 by my predecessor, Martin Welde, a project that I have been happy to support through 2 iterations. This current third one, which is probably the most ambitious one till date, actually ventures into multidisciplinary culture production and its associated conversations. I would like to thank our 2 curators, Ravi Agarwal and Ranjit Hoskote, for conceptualizing such a beautiful and robust program. I would also like to mention that we have recently opened our current exhibition on view in our gallery and the natural history section and lawns of the CSMBS Museum, titled New Natures, A Terrible Beauty is Born. It includes the works of 17 young and senior contemporary artists dealing with ecology from different perspectives. The exhibition is curated by Ravi Agarwal and includes a literary intervention by our curator of literature, Ranjit Hoskote. Today's lecture by Ilija Trojanow is the first literary intervention. Dear Ilija, I'm happy to have you with us today, unfortunately only virtually, but since Mumbai is one of your many homes, I'm very sure we will meet in person again sometime soon. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our staff, especially Amruta, Robert, Yaktish, Rakesh, and others, who despite the challenges of these times worked passionately on setting up the exhibition and the events associated with it. The work of our institute is based on creating synergies, and we are therefore excited to be working with Harkat Studio, especially to produce the hybrid event on their virtual platform. Over the next 3 months, we, along with our partners, CSMBS in Mumbai and HKW in Berlin, have planned a number of events, including a conference which begins tomorrow, all dealing with ecology. So keep an eye on our channels to check and participate in the different programs. And now I would like to hand over to Ranjit Hoskote to introduce Ilija and wish all of you an enjoyable and inspiring evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Björn. And I'd like to welcome all of you who are listening in, both on-site and online, and a very warm welcome to you, Ilija. Like Björn, I wish that you were here with us in person, but currently we are meeting in virtual space, which can be somewhat disorienting, but reaffirms a key theme in your own writing, which is the way in which communication, ideas, emotions actually transcend the barriers of distance. Ilija Trojanow is a stellar novelist and essayist whose friendship actually I've been privileged to enjoy really for 25 years. We met in Bombay, which, as Björn says, is one of his many homes. And it's a friendship and a collaboration that has evolved over the years. Ilija is the author of numerous marvelous novels. I would flag particularly Der Weltensammler, The Collector of Worlds, and EisTau, which has been rendered into English as The Lamentations of Zeno. And together we wrote a book called Kampfabsage, in English as Confluences, Forgotten Histories from East and West. At the core of Ilija Trojanow's writing is the question of how is selfhood defined and fashioned out of agency, out of choice, rather than circumstances that are imposed. What does it mean to be a refugee? What does it mean to be a nomad? And particularly in his novel EisTau, which engages with the question of climate catastrophe, he brings these questions into the context of the environmental urgencies that are upon us now. And he's going to speak today on the subject of what does it mean to write climate fiction? Is that even possible? What is involved? And to me, this is a marvelous way of beginning or inaugurating the literary axis of our project here, State of Nature, this phase, because We are concerned with how writers bear witness to this situation, just as visual artists do. How is eco-poetics to be fashioned beyond catchwords and beyond research? What is the affective claim that writers can make on their readers, on all of us? What can literature contribute to a participatory and responsible citizenship? So with these words, Ilija, I'm going to invite you to take the floor, and there's going to be a little technical framing where you're going to go onto screen. So I'm going to ask one of our colleagues here to do this for us. The floor is yours, Ilija, in about 10 seconds.
Good evening, Ranjit. Good evening, Björn, and special greetings to the people working at the Max Müller Bhavan, some of whom I've known since 1998 now. So yes, it has been nearly 25 years. People often ask me, how does a novel come about? What are the first steps? And in this case, it might tell us something about the theme of this evening. It started off with a dream, with a bad dream. I saw an elderly man sitting somewhere in a moon landscape, very desolate landscape. The man was clearly very sad. He was without hope. That was the sense I got in my dream. And he was looking around, and evidently he couldn't see what his eyes were searching for. And I woke up, and probably the only difference between the novelist and other people is that we take these things seriously, not as a psychological self-evaluation, but in terms of whether this is a narrative that needs further introspection. And in this case, the vision of this man stayed with me. What particularly stayed with me was the contrast between his solitude and the very unpleasant, not to say aggressive, landscape around him, a landscape that clearly wasn't eager to hand out any life, to allow any biological existence. It was a landscape that negated, basically, the concept of life. And I can't remember why, but I decided that this man must have been a glaciologist. Now, the interesting thing is that at that point, I wasn't particularly interested, neither in climate change, nor was I very knowledgeable about glaciers, mountains, or the North Pole, the South Pole. The only literary interaction I had actually had with that particular subject was twofold. One was by chance, an early memory, a childhood memory. I grew up in Kenya, of traveling with my school, of traveling to the north of Kenya to a place called Lake Turkana. And there was a drought. I don't know whether the teachers knew that there was a terrifying drought in that particular year. If they knew, I don't know why they took us there. But I vividly remember, it's a traumatic experience of my youth, that there was an elderly woman who was only bones and skin, and who grabbed my arm and wouldn't let go of my arm. It was as if I was the only chance she had left to be saved. And her gnarled fingers dug deep into my arm. And I really didn't know how to get out of it, because I did not want to push that woman. And her eyes were terrifying. And I came home and I wrote probably my first literary text. And it had the very kind of pathos-laden title, The Sadness of Dried Out Rivers. And in a sense, it was a requiem, which is bizarre at that age to write a requiem as your first kind of more substantial literary text besides love poems. And the second was that I traveled down the Ganges from Gangotri all the way to the Sundarbans. I think it was in 1999. And I remember doing a little bit of research on the glaciers in the Himalayas and discovering that they are not only shrinking, but that the most serious scientific studies foresee that they will disappear, probably in our lifetime. The prediction has actually been recently kind of adapted to new scientific information. So as of now, the scientific prophecy is that it might be around the year 2050, which of course will have absolutely a devastating effect on the whole of North India, which partly depends on its fresh water supply on these glaciers. And for those of you who might find this slightly exaggerated, I would just like to point out that in Bolivia, for example, the glaciers that were the water-giving sources of life, if I remember rightly, there were 3 of them. 2 of them have melted away, have thawed, have disappeared. This has been happening around the world. And if you travel through Central Europe, there's something very peculiar in that wherever you have a big glacier, there are signboards signifying where the glacier was at the beginning of industrialization. So let's say 1800, 1850, 1900, until today. And it is very, very impressive, again, in a terrifying sense, to see how this huge glacier has shrunken. So these were my only 2 interactions with that particular theme. But it's interesting to reflect upon the question whether artists, in a way, incorporate, sometimes unconsciously, certain inquietudes, certain preoccupations, a certain angst of the zeitgeist, even when they're not particularly attuned to it, in kind of an indirect reaction to the pains of the times they live in. In this case, once I'd decided that the man would have to be a glaciologist, the problem you have as a novelist is that you usually write about subjects and people who live in surroundings and in frameworks, practical and intellectual, that you know nothing about. And one of the really exciting and challenging jobs of any novelist is to research enough so that you can simulate knowledge, and at the same time to be self-aware of the fact that as much as you will and can research, you will never be as knowledgeable as someone who lives that life. So even if I studied for years on end geology and climate sciences, of course I would be just a very pathetic amateur in comparison to the specialists. So you have to balance it out. You have to gain an understanding into certain structural frameworks, necessities, foundations, and at the same time be aware of the fact that you cannot approach the subject head on as a specialist would. You would have to find, so to speak, poetic deviations. You have to take a U-turn, you have to come from the side or from behind in order to find a way to talk about something in which you are at best a well-meaning amateur and still to say something that's relevant. So the first step, of course, is to engage in a dialogue with people who are really, really knowledgeable. I went into the internet and I found out that maybe Europe's most famous glaciologist is a Swiss professor with the wonderfully Swiss name Häberli. And Professor Häberli was very kind. He invited me to his office in Zurich. And what he showed me was, in a way, a precursor to the whole aesthetic process of writing this novel. Because what he showed me was a visualization. Numbers like parts per minute, like degrees, like centimeters of rising sea levels, they remain abstract in that most people are not capable of translating such numbers into something visceral and into something existential. And what Professor Häberli did was actually to show me paintings of destruction, to be more precise, satellite pictures. And he showed me satellite pictures of one of the glaciers that he had worked on all his life. He was 60, somewhere in the Caucasian Mountains. And it showed at the beginning, let's say 30, 40 years ago, a resplendent glacier. Now, for those of you who have not had the fortune to see a glacier with their own eyes, it's truly one of the great marvels on this planet. It is majestic. It is in motion. It is continuously in motion because it actually runs on its own melted water. And it runs towards the valley. And because of that, it has a soundscape of its own. So depending on the temperatures, depending on the weight of the ice, depending on the speed of the glacier, there is a particular distinctive individual soundscape to each and every glacier. So in a way, you could regard it as a living being, although of course it would not conform with the usual definitions of biological definitions of what is alive and what is not. But it is something that's very impressive and something you can fall in love with easily. And then after 5 years, after 10 years, the glaciers on these pictures that Professor Häberli showed me started to turn gray. And then it started to turn blackish. And what happens, as we all know, is that, of course, the darker the color, the less well it reflects heat, the better it absorbs heat. And thus the fact that in the process of weakening the ice, it actually becomes a self-destructive, unavoidable end, or you could say death, to that particular glacier. And that is what the pictures showed. The most recent ones showed bits and pieces of black ice, completely blackened ice, and in between, a moon-like landscape. And you can well imagine that I was in a way shocked to see at least parts of my bad dream on two huge screens in an office in Zurich. At which I told Professor Häberli what, in the meantime, the reasons I had given this man I dreamed of for being so sad, for being so desperate. And that reason was that he had lost his glacier and that he was looking for ways to come to terms with this destruction that he took personally. And Professor Häberli looked at me as if I had fallen from the sky. And with great astonishment, he said, well, this is amazing, but this is more or less the way I feel. So there you have a certain artistic intuition, beautifully reacting to, unconsciously, a certain scientific and biographical reality. So then, of course, the next question was, how do you write about climate change without being too evident, too dogmatic, without basically forcing the readers to accept certain axioms, certain prepositions? And the only way I could figure it out was to stay with this idea, with the theme of love, and to come up with a kind of ménage à trois. Usually, as you know, one man, two women, or one woman, two men in a love triangle. In this case, it was a glaciologist in love with his glacier and then falling in love with another woman. Another, of course, being wrong in this context, with a woman. So it was an unusual ménage à trois. But the second thing you always have to figure out at the beginning of a novel is the location. So in a way, it's similar to how movie people go about their business. Locations are very important, especially if you believe, and of course, one of the greatest masters of this is the hugely admired Thomas Hardy, especially if you believe that there has to be a correlation, an interdependence between your characters and the landscape. And it occurred to me that in order for this novel to be both convincing and not too tragic, it would have to be somewhere where you still have the resplendence of the glaciers. And one of the few places on the planet is the Antarctic. So it became clear to me that this particular scientist, having given up on his work because his glacier is dead, the glacier that he has accompanied with scientific methods all his life, would then turn his back to this particular line of work and go to work as a specialist who gives talks on one of these ships that travel to the Antarctic. And this is exactly what I did. So I actually traveled twice to the Antarctic. Something I usually do, I research at the beginning of the novel, and then once the first draft is completed, a second time in order to test and to check on the suppositions of the novel. Now, the interesting thing in regard to the Antarctic is that we don't actually have a language to describe something that has not been previously seen by human beings. Of course, a few people have traveled there, but they're very few and far in between. It's a bit like anyone having to write something, be it in a science fiction novel or in a fantasy novel, that is beyond the scope of what we've experienced until now, even more radical, which might be utopian in character. Language, in many ways, reconfirms the status quo. We like to, especially if we're authors, we like to imagine that language has a kind of visionary, radical aspect to it that needs to be tickled out by our perseverance and or talent. But I'm not sure that's true. I think that language is very much something that stands in the way of radical thinking because it is so very much attuned to the existing, to the status quo, and is used to reaffirm it. So it's not a small challenge to write about the eternal ice and the landscape that has not been inhabited by human beings, except for, of course, a few scientists. But they have rarely written. Actually, if you do a Google search, you'll find out that very, very few people have ever written about the Antarctic, and very few people have written about this particular landscape. The second question was, of course, how do you translate the very particular combination of enormous, exceptional knowledge that my main character, Zeno, the professor, carries within his mind and his very, very particular passion and longing. Because once again, a language that is too distanced, as we would assume a scientific language would have to be, and a language that is too sentimental, that is too laden with emotion, as we would assume the language of a lover would have to be. Of course, the two contradict one another, maybe even exclude each other. And of course, it would be very, very difficult to find a balance. So this was the challenge. And I couldn't possibly tell you whether the novel succeeds in navigating between these two extremes. The only thing I could tell you as an anecdotal kind of self-satisfactory reply is that the leading institute in the world on the study of the South and North Pole is the Alfred Wegener Institute in the north of Germany, in a harbor city called Bremerhaven. Very important European city because millions of people who emigrated to North America, especially to the United States, went through Bremerhaven, which is why it has a brilliant museum of migration and immigration. There's a Bavarian glaciologist in that particular institute in Bremerhaven, and this institute helped me do some further research. And when I presented the novel in their institute, his wife came up to me and said, since she's read the novel, she actually has started nicknaming her husband Zeno or Zeno, because the character in the novel so closely resembles apparently this particular scientist who I did not know personally before I wrote the novel. So back to the challenge. Now, just to make clear that we're talking about somewhere around 2008, 2009, and climate fiction was not a thing then. I don't think the term existed even. What I do remember is that when the book came out, there was a lot of doubt in the media whether this is actually a subject worthy of literary treatment. People were suggesting, literary critics were suggesting, that this is best left to scientists or to those people who popularize scientific insights, and that the novel is not the right format. It's not adequate to this particular theme or topic, which of course makes no sense whatsoever, since the novel has always been the most inclusive genre that we actually have. When you look at the great novels from throughout the world, they are, regardless of their style, their themes, regardless of whether they're very focused and kind of very self-insulated, or whether they embrace the whole world. The one thing that makes the novel special is that there's nothing that is alien to it. You can bring in nearly every form of existence, and you can include nearly every form of thinking. Anything between the mind and the matter can easily be incorporated into a novel. So why not climate change? And of course, it's interesting to quickly delve on this, because the 10 years since have completely changed the public attitude. And now everybody speaks of climate fiction as if it's always been there. And this particular novel, EisTau, The Lamentations of Zeno, is now suddenly an early classic of climate fiction, as opposed to a nonsensical treatment of a subject best left to the scientists. And this is interesting, especially because we realize how misunderstood the function of literature still is, or has become, in that because of this, what I call sweet and sour realism that defines literature around the world, it has become an accepted truism that the intimate is the landscape of literature, while the vast, global, universal, cosmic issues are best left to other forms of intellectual treatment. And I think this is a sad state of affairs because, especially with climate change, for two reasons which I think are central to what we're going to discuss today, but also to the whole series and the whole idea of how we can, as artists, contribute to the radical transformation that is necessary. For two reasons. One is that people still, even if they're digital natives, even if they do not read, they still tell each other stories. They still make sense of their lives and the larger issues at hand through narratives. They still are incapable, usually, of understanding complex, abstract formulas, and very capable of understanding a good anecdote, a solid joke, a wonderful short story, a purposeful and enthralling poem, and so on and so forth. So this hasn't changed at all. And when you look at things that are fashionable, be it computer games, be it, of course, TV series, they're all based actually on certain forms of and formats of narrative. So it would seem ridiculous to exclude narration from one of the biggest challenges mankind has yet to deal with. That would be my first argument. The second argument, of course, is that I don't think in human history we've ever had true transformation, radical change, without certain aesthetic and linguistic, how to put it, either pavings of the way or parallel support systems. I actually find it, the more and more I think about it, impossible to imagine that what has to happen, which is a change not only of our economic system, but also of our mindsets, how that could happen without us developing an aesthetic alternative. Of course not, and I don't have in mind a blueprint valid for everybody. What I mean is expanding our aesthetic options and our language into the realm of the possible, but not yet existing. Thus kind of foreseeing through language and art the necessities of change. This goes hand in hand, of course, with activism. This goes hand in hand with public discourse. But it's absolutely necessary. And therefore, I think if one, as is the case with me, if one is mainly a novelist and an essayist, most of what I do is trying to come up with a language and a form that is not completely detached from existing measures and existing conventions, but which opens windows and opens doors to let in something which is more a sense of longing at the moment than a sense of exactitude. And I'm sure, Ranjit, that once we start our conversation, our jugalbandi, we can maybe go deeper into this question, which seems to me to be maybe the most important one. And to finish off, just to tell you the one additional aspect that seemed to me very, very important. And that is, since the story is told from the perspective of Zeno, the perspective of a glaciologist who's desperately fallen in love and out of love, I needed another level in the novel that would represent the exact opposite of a very, very sensitive, eccentric, unique human being who has decided, and I won't tell you how because you might want to read the novel, who's decided to basically start resisting the system. But this is a very unique voice. I needed something that represents not only society, but also something that represents the onslaught of noise which drowns out these individual voices of reason. And therefore, you have in between the sections which Zeno narrates, you have a kind of very, very dissonant assembly of voices that completely overwhelm you as a reader because they are in a very, very frenzied rhythm. They not always make sense, and they basically make it impossible, as long as they last, to focus completely on Zeno's interventions and his suggestions and his dreams. And just one anecdote to finish off, which I found very, very interesting. At one reading in Hamburg, again a harbor city, a man came up to me and said, well, he found these passages, these kind of dissonant, multi-layered noise confusion passages. He found those most interesting because it relates to his profession. And I asked him, well, what is your profession? And he said, I'm head of an advertising agency here in Hamburg. And do you happen to know how many ads a modern urban dweller in one of the big cities, mega cities of the world encounters a day? And I said, well, my guess would be a few hundred. And he said, no, several thousand. Of course, not if he stays at home and doesn't switch on neither radio nor TV. But if he's a normal human being, taking public transport, going to work, at work, and so on and so forth, going out in the evening, shopping, it would be between 2,000 and 5,000 different advertising messages that bombard you. And I thought to myself, this is actually part of the problem. And this is why, if you're looking for aesthetic solutions, you sometimes find an answer to problems that you are not even aware of. Because we all know that there's too much noise around, but we're not always aware of what this noise consists of and how it is negatively affecting our capacity to think and feel clearly enough to make sense of the world and maybe even to change it. So this, I hope, is enough to kind of get us started. And thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our conversation, Ranjit.
Sorry, we're all getting used to these technological disorientations, but let me thank you first for a truly inspiring and thoughtful journey through your writing, through your particular engagement with climate catastrophe, and also the way in which you've drawn for us the portrait of a writer who would intervene in public debates. And I want to, before we move on to EisTau and the particular formal choices, I want to draw you out a little on this. As you ended, you spoke of, I mean, for one thing, you talked about how there was 2011 when EisTau came out, there was a wave of negative criticism where people felt that this subject should be left to expert culture, and why is a novelist dealing with it? And the big shift today where, under the sign of eco-poetics, it's very much the subject of literary effort. But also this question of how, as an essayist with Ulitse, for instance, you've worked on the state and surveillance systems. You and I have worked together on questions of civilizational identity and transcultural initiatives that have produced culture over time. So what is your sense of who the unknown reader is? Because this is not an audience that you can take for granted in the way in which a public intellectual, so to speak, can take for granted, who usually speaks out of an academic or a media context. So could you talk to us a little about this, the novelist and his unknown reader?
Yeah, certainly. Well, you know that in countries like Germany, France, and the US, a lot has been written in the last few decades about the death of the public intellectual. And every time there's a huge, let's speak about Germany. Every time there's some huge debate, people would say, well, we lack people like Günter Grass and Heinrich Böll, people of stature who would explain this to the audience at large. And in a way, it is true that you do not have a few kind of heroes of the public discourse from a literary or intellectual point of view that would seem to speak for the whole of educated society. But in another way, this was a form of aristocratic simulation of discourse, because people like Sartre in France, people like Günter Grass in Germany, and so on, they assumed the mantle of priesthood. They were larger than life figures who were expected to pass out judgment, a bit like the headmaster and society being full of unruly schoolboys, some interested, some less, and so on, and schoolgirls, of course. And I'm not sure whether this was actually such a good thing to have, because the people I know, and I knew Günter Grass also personally, and I've engaged with him, and I've read a lot about Sartre. It seems to me that these people then were forced into a kind of, or were pushed into a kind of megalomania, to put it bluntly, because society or the public sphere expected this of them. And they were maybe too aware of that particular function of explaining the world to society at large, which had then limitations, I think, of cognizance, of understanding, and of course also of aesthetical achievement. I mean, the two people I mentioned, and this I think is true for quite a number of other such so-called major figures, their work after a certain period of time became actually very uninspired and conventional. So they might have fallen prey to a certain position that was bestowed upon them. While in today's world, since none of us is expected to fill these shoes, which in any case, as everybody says, are too large for us, I think there's a newfound freedom in that I don't have to, when I write, I don't even for a second imagine myself expounding the truth to the whole of society. There's, I think, an understanding right from the beginning that I can be free to engage in my own radical experiments of thought and poetry, because in any case, I will be speaking to a smaller group of interested people. So in a way, I would like to challenge this understanding that we, that things have, really, really gone down the drain in terms of no more public intellectuals, which have a big influence and so on and forth. I think as an accumulated mass of individual and maybe more radical voices, we might actually be doing a better job. Of course, I can't be sure about this, but I would just like people to think about it, that it's not necessarily to lose a priest and to gain a lot of free believers is maybe not a bad thing.
That sounds absolutely marvelous. And thank you for putting that in perspective. Now, before we go on to speak about your formal play and the linguistic choices in the novel, could I ask you as maybe an intermezzo to read a passage from EisTau, from the Lamentations of Zeno?
Well, this is a passage chosen by Ranjit Hoskote, so I'm not responsible for its quality. No one in the Institute had any illusion that I might consider changing my object of inquiry. The very phrase makes me think of an ingrown toenail, not at an age when my beard is straggling toward retirement. Nonetheless, I couldn't continue as I was. The Alps had become unbearable. What was there to be gained by accompanying one more glacier to its death? And to go on giving lectures undeterred seemed as grotesque as teaching veterinary medicine to paleontologists. No, there was no alternative but to bow out. 2 colleagues invited me to join them in the Caucasian mountains. They didn't want to see me leave the Institute, and for that most sentimental of all reasons, they were used to my being there. You can cook for us in base camp, they joked. Actually, I was considered an exceptionally gifted chef, a reputation that rested solely on the large pot of Jamaican fish soup that I always brought to our summer parties. The first time I made it, they were dumbfounded. No one expected a dish like that, and with that name and those ingredients and that taste. No one expected that from me, a man who considers the tropics anathema in general, the Caribbean a steam pit in particular, and the idea of serving frutti di mare in the foothills of the Alps, the epitome of decadence. And I would have no idea about the soup if a certain Jamaican who grew up in England hadn't fallen in love with a young woman from Munich. He made ends meet teaching advanced conversational English at the Münchner Volkshochschule, where we discussed ska lyrics by Madness and read excerpts from George Mikish's How to Be an Alien. At the end of the semester, he invited the whole class over, gathered us in his kitchen, and then, with the flourish of a circus director, he opened the lid of a pot with a diameter as big as an oak's and let out aromas that could spawn legends, fantasies of lazy afternoons, rocking on boats with straw roofs, or of diving into scallop beds. I took the course again the following year, even though my English was in good shape, not least thanks to an intensive exchange with colleagues from the University of East Anglia and the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. I did it just to get another taste of this soup and some idea how to make it.
The reason I've always loved that passage is because it really speaks to this core theme in your writing. The ways in which culture is invented, it gets invented out of contingencies, out of trauma, difficulties, survival, and its fragrances go across borders. But I would like to think through with you the passage you've made from Weltansammler, which is portrait of one of the great Victorian explorers. It's the life of someone who was a border crosser, Sir Richard Burton, but whose border crossing was underwritten by a certain imperial certainty. From there to Zeno, whose life is underwritten by instability. What was that passage like? In each case, there's a profound global vision, but it seems to me like there's been a great movement from one framework of looking at the world to another. Could you engage with that?
Yeah. Well, people sometimes make fun of me that the only way I can write is writing about the whole world. In German, it's difficult to translate, but in German, someone said, "Ohne Welt tut es nicht." So a rough translation would be, if he can't bring in the whole world, he's not gonna get it done, or he's not gonna deal with it. So the world, Dunya, was in my first novel, and it was, as you mentioned, in my second novel, The Collector of Worlds, and it's in the title of several other texts. But the reason is, and this is, I think, the core of your question, the reason is not one of kind of touristic exoticism. It is one of connections that I have been privileged to experience just because of my very peculiar biography as someone who grew up in communist Bulgaria. Then we were refugees in refugee camps in Italy and in Germany. Then by chance, my father got a job in Kenya. I grew up in Kenya. I lived in Paris. I studied in Munich. I lived in Mumbai, and I taught in the US at universities. I've lived in Cape Town. I live in Vienna and Stuttgart, and so on and so forth. And this was not something that, most of it was not something I chose. I was kind of, in a way, forced into it. But what happened is that I kept on seeing connections, or as we say, confluences, in places where other people saw borders and categories and different insulated and isolated essential identities, which might greet one another, but certainly not shake hands, certainly not embrace, and absolutely not merge into one another. So, in a way, I think this is the center of all my writing, because I very much believe that writing comes from attention. And what your personal, individual attention is attuned to usually becomes good poetry and good literature if it surprises the readers. Very rarely is it a reconfirmation of something that everybody notices. It's usually a way of looking at the world which is new to other people. And what is new to us, of course, not only exciting, but very often it comes across as being profound because it challenges the established notions. And it draws us into the zones of discomfort because we have to reassess our own cognizance, our own belief systems, and so on and so forth. Now, the difference, of course, between Richard Burton and Zeno is one not of my own definition, but one of epoch, one of history. Richard Burton actually, and this is the fascinating thing when you look at Victorian travelers, or even more pre-Victorian travelers, in a way he was part of a fishing exhibition. Expedition. Part of a fishing expedition. So just imagine you go deep sea fishing, but you have no idea what kind of fish there are out there. Just imagine no one told you there's sharks and blue marlins and tuna and barracuda and so on and so forth. And suddenly you come up with all these fish. In a way, there is a very human misconception that because you caught them, you in a way have if not created them, then at least brought them into the daylight. And therefore you are something like the midwife, or you are someone who's named them, as was of course the case. I mean, part of the Collector of Words is making fun of the fact that in these early expeditions through Africa, these people were running around throwing out names, giving out names, as if they were at a birthday party giving out presents. So this is a completely different relationship to the world, one that one could critically call paternalistic, but one at the same time of awe and constant surprise and disbelief, and then the very interesting way these people then instrumentalize this disbelief in self-aggrandizing narratives which made them the great Victorian heroes. I mean, they were actually as huge in the mausoleum of Victorian hagiography as were, let's say, the astronauts of the 60s or 70s. The difference to Zeno is, of course, that Zeno is at the other end, maybe, at the exact opposite of this peculiar development. There's nothing new or fresh, quite the opposite. The glaciers have been discovered. The glaciers have been more or less analyzed to a point that science knows how they come about, how they function, how they melt, how they move, what they're affected by. So there's this profound kind of X-ray vision of the world. And this, of course, leads to several very differing reactions. One is one of modesty, this kind of larger-than-life position that someone like Richard Burton had would be impossible for someone like Zeno. Richard Burton is accumulating, be it discoveries or legends. Zeno is counting his losses. This is withdrawal. There's very little out there that can be discovered by him, but there's a lot that will be lost to him. And of course, very much the glaciers, and then the Antarctica. And the really tragic thing is that what the novel in parts foresees as a threat, which is the melting of the Antarctic Peninsula, has in fruition increased really dramatically. Actually, last year, especially the specialized media was full of new studies and new measurements that show that the Antarctic Peninsula is melting at a terrifying level. So, although both of them are global figures, although both of them strive for a certain universal position or mindset, and I think it's important to note that there's a lot of bashing going on these days against these colonial figures. And of course, some of it is absolutely justified. But we shouldn't forget that they were not all Eurocentric monsters. Actually, a number of them, and Richard Burton is one of them, had an understanding or had a longing for universality. It was different to what we would regard nowadays as truly kind of globally dignified and adequate to people, especially in the global south. But nonetheless, this longing for universality carried them to an enormous, I would say close to obsessive curiosity. So all these important translations that Richard Burton made, of course, famous things like 1001 Nights or Kama Sutra or Pancharanga and so on and so forth, Perfume Garden. And so both from Sanskrit, from Hindi, from Arab, from the Arabic, from the Persian, those wouldn't have happened without his striving for a kind of universal exchange. And of course, the same thing, since we're in the Max Müller-Bauern, I think it's important to remind people that the holy texts of India wouldn't be this kind of clearly codified without the enormous achievements of Max Müller. And maybe it would have happened later on, maybe in different forms, but I think it would be difficult to claim that his work was one of cultural appropriation that's only negative. And I think it's important nowadays to, especially with some young people who are very kind of overly excited, to tell them, hold your horses, things are slightly more complex. And although we are, of course, radical critics of colonialism, one shouldn't throw out all these incredible people who are ambivalent characters of a globalization avant la lettre, but at the same time, they were, I think, worthy of our attention. So to answer your question, Zeno is someone who basically is caught up in a globalization that has been achieved, but in a globalization whose results for him are one of utter destruction. Not only we've talked now today a lot about ecology, but also on a social level, the ship he's on, the cruise ship, for very, very affluent travelers who go to the Antarctic, is very much a representation of the global social stratas. So you have the mostly Asian, actually, in the case of the two journeys I undertook, Philippine workers who are truly, most of them, invisible. I mean, I was traveling not as a tourist, but as kind of part of the crew, so I would be sometimes with them, and many of them are somewhere deep down in the ship. You never see them. They make the whole thing possible. And so these are also kind of other negative aspects of the globalized world that Zeno encounters, that Zeno reflects upon. But at the same time, there's this desperation of things having gone too far. So not only, to finish off, sorry for the extended answer, not only is Zeno old, but there's a certain sense that he has that humanity has become old. It's kind of this excitement of seeing something for the first time. It's gone. It's more like the heavy, traumatic question, are we seeing this for the last time?
I see what you mean. While I was reading the book, I kept thinking to myself, this is a scenario that reminds me so much of the work of Alan Secular, for instance. The life of the sea, the class asymmetries on land that get translated into maritime contexts. And I thought this ship is more a ship of fools, an Narrenschiff, and not really Noah's Ark. But I want to take these questions of the recurrent themes, the need to revisit moments in history and genres, to the closing question maybe of this evening, Ilija, which is that you don't let go of prior traditions in the novel, so to speak. I mean, there's a way in which EisTau takes its place in a certain kind of science fiction or catastrophe fiction. There's a way in which Weltensammler, for instance, is a critical retake on a certain kind of biographical celebration of a great life. Your work in travel writing and reportage really comes through. It informs all of these novelistic adventures. And you're currently working on a utopian novel, taking up that tradition, where it seems to me that the borders being crossed are not spatial but temporal. And it seems to me that the key trope there is survival, and resources of hope are somehow pointed to. So in conclusion, would you like to give us a sense, a glimpse of this work in progress?
Well, it's probably the most radical project I've ever undertaken, and because this particular tradition that you referred to, the utopian novel, is more or less dead. It exists in a very peculiar form in science fiction writing. But there it is, it's mixed up with other kind of forms and formats that are very, very kind of sectarian. And it's interesting that big parts of science fiction are in a kind of self-imposed ghetto in terms of the readership, very much for a certain crowd of people. But outside of that, it's all dystopia. It's 99.9% dystopia, also in films. So you mentioned the word hope. I think hope, first of all, of course, I think we can easily agree that there's no possible existence, neither on an individual level nor for mankind, without a robust hope. I mean, not one of simulation, not one of drugs, but one of kind of existential certitude, one of exclamation marks, not question marks. And the utopian, both philosophy and novel writing, was one of the arenas where this hope was played out. Now, I think the important thing to ask, and this is how I started my novel, is why have we lost that? And there are several reasons. One, of course, is this kind of, to put it bluntly, ideology of there is no alternative, the ideology of this is the end of history, the ideology is there's one fit for everybody, which is kind of the neoliberal globalized economy. The other thing, and this seems to me now to be even more substantial, is a lack of fantasy, a lack of imagination. I think we are in dire straits because imagination has basically been kind of washed out of our intellectual system. It's something that has not been kind of developed, supported, inspired in our schools, which are becoming more and more oriented towards preparing people for certain jobs, certain challenges. It's completely gone out of the window in the universities, which are becoming more and more kind of, as one very important book written by a German professor a few years ago says, that the capitalization of knowledge, which is what will it kind of, how will it profit? What are the profits? And of course, imagination was never, true imagination was never profitable in that sense. And this is the theme of our evening today, how do we come up with new narratives and with a new language? In our narratives, the defining form for the last few decades has been the remix. When you look at something like Game of Thrones, which, if I'm not mistaken, was the most popular, the most successful TV series of all times, and truly a global affair, it's nothing more but I liked it, I'm the last to criticize it as a form of entertainment, but it is a rehash of stories that go back to King Arthur and of course to Shakespeare and to the Song of Roland and so on and so forth. I mean, you have all these mostly medieval or Renaissance stories that are kind of rehashed. And this is one aspect. And the other aspect, what's happened, especially in literature, is the autopoetic form. We've been drowned out by people who feel that if they narrate their own life and their own perspective on life in a kind of very personal, intimate language, this will in some way, and they are successful. I mean, authors like Knausgaard from Norway, Ferrante from Italy, and so on and so forth, they are extremely successful, again, as global phenomena of literature, by basically saying literature doesn't need imagination. My life is enough. This is the kind of extractive field, arena where I'm going to do my digging. These two things are so dominant in today's arts. I don't, of course, as you know, I know very little of the visual arts, but very much in my field of line of work, that imagination is no longer regarded even as a quality of writing. I don't remember when I last read a review when someone said, this author has a wonderful imagination. And I think this is really a serious matter we have to look at, because imagination is, to quote the great Austrian author Musil, is what he calls der Möglichkeitssinn, so the sense of possibility. But the interesting thing is when you look at how he uses the word, it is not in a sense of what is possible as an argument to oppose utopian ideas, which is what happens nowadays. The moment you say something which is outside of the confines of the existing, people say, well, that is not possible. He didn't mean it that way. He meant it as the liberation of human thinking into the diversity of possibilities, which is maybe the most valuable diversity there is. Again, diversity we've reduced nowadays to something very superficial, the diversity of kind of ontological evidence. While the diversity, I think that's truly important, is the diversity of coming up with visions, ideas of the greatest width and breadth possible, the Möglichkeitssinn. And that is sorely lacking in contemporary literature, which is why, with my own sense of taking on more than I can carry, I embarked on this journey. And to put it very simply is, I think you can only narrate this particular diversity by using a great many of the existing literary forms, by kind of having a central explosion of intrinsic literary qualities and values, and thus to overwhelm the reader, to seduce the reader into the beauties of literature, which then, as becomes evident while you read on, are also the beauties of utopian thinking. While most of utopian literature until now has been quite a sad affair of kind of rigid preconditioning. And the second thing is, utopia cannot be an end in itself. It has to be a process. And in order to describe the process, you have to go back in time. So the only way I think you can tell the story of utopias, always plural, is by having time travel and by people from these more utopian societies coming back to the worlds that we know, the epochs that we know, and thus to have a dynamic interaction between what has existed and what is potentially the future, if we have the courage to imagine a positive future. And just one final word, it seems to me at the moment that people are thirsty for this kind of hope. Because last summer, I had a 1-hour talk in the Austrian radio, and something very interesting happened. They told me afterwards that they received more letters, emails, phone calls than ever before. People showing a great, great interest and curiosity towards ideas of utopia. So I think we are now at a watershed moment of human history. I think, I not only think that there are actually studies that show that a majority of people understand, meanwhile, that this particular system, this kind of fossil fuel extractive, destructive system of not cooperating with nature, of destroying something that is valuable in order to produce something that is unnecessary, this kind of slavery underneath the dictate of continuous growth, this profit-driven greed, this inequality. I think a growing number of people, maybe even a majority, realize meanwhile that this has no future. This is just a ridiculous dead end. But we have not yet reached the point of, as the old Greeks used to say, kairos, which I've always really loved. So it's not time, it is the moment, the historical moment, Marx would have said. But kairos is, of course, the young man who runs by you, and he has hair, a lock of hair in the front, and he's cleanly shaven in the back of his head. And therefore, if you miss the moment and you try to grasp him, he'll be gone. Also, he's covered in oil, so he's going to slip through your fingers. And this moment of kairos, which has always been the moment where history fascinates me most, there are certain moments when everything seems possible. And sometimes radical change has happened in these moments. This is, I think, what is now going to be the next stage of human history. And therefore, I'm very, very positive that we, in our line of work, and ours happens to be artistic, we have to prepare for this moment by thinking about it, and above all, by narrating it in different languages, different forms, different possibilities. And let's see what happens.
Thank you so much, Ilija. I think it was a magical and a transformative image to close with, the image of kairos, the moment that calls out to be seized. And I don't think we could have asked for a better overture or prelude to this project, because we are also equally concerned with not only meditating on the urgencies, but also we would like to think through what are the ways forward, what are the strategies to be adopted, what kinds of transformations of consciousness and practice we need to undertake. So thank you very much indeed for your vibrant and optimistic and really rich discussion of the issues at stake. And as always, you've been very, very generous with your time, your attention, and everything that you've brought to bear on the presentation and conversation. And the next time we hope it's here.
Thank you for inviting me, everybody, and also the Max Müller Bhavan, of course. And thank you for your questions, Ranjit. And good luck with this truly important project, which, and this is one last thought of hope, which, thank God, is a project that is in line with other similar projects around the world. I think we are part, I mean, it sounds a little bit pathos-laden, but I think we are part of a movement. People are becoming attuned to the necessity of these projects. And so, seize the moment.
Venceremos.
Carpe diem.
Thank you so much, Ilija. And thank you everyone on site and online who was with us this evening.